Hello everyone, my name is Jason Ross and I'm the publisher of woodcentral.com.au, the world's largest platform for timber and mass timber news. And today I'm joined by Daniel Wright, the National Business Development Manager for Australian Sustainable Hardwoods, the largest hardwood manufacturer in Australia. So Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we're here today to talk about Australian Sustainable Hardwoods, or ASH, and who you are and how you got to where you are. So could you give the listener a brief introduction to ASH?
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. So we are ASH, Australian Sustainable Hardwoods. We're the largest hardwood sawmill in Australia, but we're also the largest hardwood manufacturer. So that makes us a vertically integrated manufacturer who's in control of our supply from log right through to finished product. We have 13 manufacturing lines at our plant up in Hayfield in Gippsland. We make things from mass timber, engineered flooring, window components, stair laminated components, and a whole range of other architectural joinery items.
Fantastic. And so were you impacted at all with the recent Vic Forest closure?
We were. 10 years ago, the company was 100% supplied by Victorian-based regrowth hardwood. We are now zero. So we've had a massive shift over that period. We would have liked more time to do that. We had the rug pulled out from under us only a couple of years ago, but we've been working towards a change because of the government policy shift. And now we import timbers we're the largest American oak importer into the country. We're now the largest user of plantation oak, plantation grown wood fibre, which was largely destined for pulp. We're turning that into nice high-end architectural products and mass timber products. And we've been able to ramp up a really high quality use out of our Tasmanian oak resource.
So a bit about that American oak. So ASH is now the largest importer of American oak into Australia. Is that correct?
Correct, by far.
Fantastic. And why did you choose American oak, or I understand it's glacial oak, is it, by comparison to some of the other substitutes?
It is. We were specific about branding the American oak that we bring in as glacial oak because there's typically American oaks are broken into two different fields, white oak and red oak. And white oak's typically their largest export volume, and red oak is largely used for their domestic applications with a decent export market for America. But the red oak particularly has different characteristics depending on where you purchase that within the US. Some of it is quite pink, fast grown and not so stable. Still a great hardwood, but some of it is a superior quality timber, stable, tight growth rings, consistently blonde. So what we've done is we've targeted that blonde coloured high performing timber, but then we process it through our timber mill and through our manufacturing plants, which makes it a suitable alternative to the lost fibre in Victorian ash. We had to brand it. So Glacial Oak's the brand that we landed on. Suits it well.
There's been a lot of recent reporting through Wood Central about the import of Brazilian-based timbers, particularly to meet the requirements for BEL 19 bushfire housing in timber frames in windows and doors. Is there a reason why ASH chose the American oak route and not a Brazilian or a Latin American equivalent as well?
Yeah, there is. It's not specifically Brazilian or Latin American. We looked globally for an alternative to Victorian ash, and specifically with relation to BEL 19, that was one of the reasons people use Victorian ash. It's a very popular window timber on the east coast of Australia or the southeast, and it's 650 kilograms a cube on average in density at 12% moisture content, which makes it past BEL 19, bushfire attack level 19. A lot of the timbers we looked at globally, when we look at replacing Victorian ash, we look for properties and characteristics that are suitable and similar to the Victorian ash resource that we lost. And a lot of those Latin American or plantation grown timbers from around the world, they don't have the density that they have in their native regrowth counterpart or native old growth. Not that we touched that, but the plantation resource grows faster, and it typically doesn't have an average density of 650 kilograms or greater. It's typically less. So our plantation grown eucalyptus nitens that we call plantation oak. In native forests, it would have been 700 kilograms a cube and would have passed that BAL 19 rating. We can't sell it for BAL 19 here because it's about 600 kilograms a cube because of the speed of the growth in those plantations. It's the same thing in these South American species. They just don't have the density.
So can you just briefly touch on for the listener what a BAL rating is and how it applies for window furnishings?
Sure. So a bushfire attack level or BAL rating is the window's ability to resist bushfire attack. It's based on Australian standards 3959, and depending on the level of exposure to a bushfire and the intensity of a bushfire, a window will need to help defend the occupant for a certain amount of time. So being 650 kilograms per cube is BAL 19. That's a moderate level of bushfire attack for a window. There's the next one up is BAL 29, which only 7 species are able to be used for here in Australia. The next one up is BAL 40. Now, some of our window makers have passed BAL 40 using our timbers, but they've had specific tests undertaken at accredited laboratories to be able to say that. So some of them have BAL 40. The next one up is flame zone, where really you need fire shutters to protect the windows.
And the majority of housing within the urban areas wouldn't be a high BAL rating, would it? It's more of the high bushfire prone areas. Is that correct?
Well, if you look at a map of Victoria and there's some interactive maps that you can look up for BAL ratings in different regions. About 80% of Victoria is at least BAL 12.5. So, and obviously that number decreases a little bit with BAL 19, but essentially inner city suburbs are the only regions that can be used at below BAL 19. Everything else, coastal areas, outer suburbs, leafy suburbs, and of course the bush are at least BAL 19. So you're covering a huge part of Victoria.
And does Ash have an extensive outreach to suppliers and to builders to sort of communicate those requirements with around BAL as well?
Look, typically, Ash supply all around the country, and we supply through resellers and through manufacturers. And typically, the way it works with BAL ratings is the builders or the homeowners, whoever's building, developers, they'll be given guidance on what BAL rating their home or their building needs to meet, and it's up to them to request windows that meet or exceed that requirement. We don't get too involved in that, although we have a clear line of communication about how our timbers will perform and what can be expected. It's up to the window manufacturer who's supplying those to the builders and the building surveyors to understand that they are passing their BAL ratings.
So does the majority of Ash products as an internal element? So do you have any external products that are sort of applied to an external setting as well?
Yeah, good question. Most of our timbers, so I mentioned before, we do glacial oak, our version of American oak. We do Tasmanian oak, and now the new emerging species is plantation-grown nitens, which we call plantation oak. All of those are naturally not so durable outside. High-performing timbers from an appearance and performance perspective when they're used internally. So they're used extensively in architectural joinery, stairs, windows, floors, those sorts of things. When it comes to using them externally, they're not naturally durable. So we've teamed up with the TrueCore system with Copcoat, probably 12 years ago now. We used to use a H3 treatment from a previous supplier. It was an LOSP H3 treatment, which only had a 2 millimeter penetration on the envelope. we teamed up with the TrueCore system about 12 years ago now, and we applied that treatment to all of those species I mentioned before, and that gives us confidence to sell moulded products, claddings, deckings, window components, with a 25-year guarantee for termites and decay resistance.
I understand it's water-based as well, isn't it, as opposed to typical treatments?
Correct. Being water-based and pressure treated, it allows us to penetrate deep into the core of thick sections of timber. So, and we're doing that with a water-based additive. So previously with an LOSP, you're talking about a solvent. So by using a water-based, it's a much more user-friendly product. It's safer for humans, but the handling for our manufacturing supply chain is a lot easier. It's easier for them to coat with water-based or oil-based coatings. It's easier for them to handle and reapply. It's a great product.
Has it been used in any major projects around Melbourne, for example?
Yeah, the most notable project we've used the TrueCore system in would be Margaret Court Arena. Now this is going back probably eight years, maybe. The external timber components, the fins, the battens, is about 300 cubic metres, I think, in that job in total. So yeah, most people in Melbourne would be familiar with Margaret Court Arena.
Yes, of course. It's one of the most famous tennis venues in the world, I think, isn't it? It's Nick Kyrgios's favourite venue.
I'd say so. Yeah, it's a great venue too.
Yes, yes. So, ash, are you also involved in the mass timber market as well? So often we think of ash, we think of a hardwood product that's involved in internal settings. Are you sort of veering into that mid-rise mass timber market as well?
Yeah, we are. Look, we've been glue laminating timber for 30 years. We've been the largest glue laminator of hardwood products for most of that time. And I mentioned before the new species that we're playing around with in a large way, plantation oak. So when the writing was on the wall 7 years ago about the regrowth native forest estate, and as we were developing this new species, plantation oak, it became evident that a large portion of that timber didn't have a home. And at that stage, mass timber and CLT construction was emerging in Australia with some interest. So we developed MassSlam as a way to help builders replace concrete and steel in these big commercial office buildings. So we just did a 15-storey full timber building, for example. So it helps the builders decarbonise by transitioning away from concrete and steel and towards sustainable, renewable materials that are better than carbon neutral. So it solves that problem, but it also helps us find a great high-value application for a resource that was otherwise going for wood chip and pulp. Nobody had been able to turn that resource into high-quality timber before, and we'd been playing with it for years, and it became obvious that the trick to it, yes, you can get a small portion to the high-end architectural market, but successful and responsible resource use involves finding a home for absolutely everything. So 100% of the log that we get needs to be sold for its highest value application for a long-term use. Mass timber really gives us that opportunity. So going back 5 years ago now, we made the leap and we bought the world's largest post and beam robotic CNC machine, a Hundegger K2i, 450 thickness. That has 160 tools in this one machine. That was a quantum leap for us back then to get into mass timber manufacturing. We've now got our third Hundegger robotic CNC that we've just installed and frantically growing that space.
Yes, it's interesting. Michael Barnard, a very famous global futurist, last month said that the key to a post-concrete world is actually to better utilize engineered wood products and better use the 3.5 billion cubic meters of timber we use every year around the world. And I guess that's a really good example, isn't it, of better optimizing and creating higher value products from lower value products.
Absolutely, it is. It's a really good use of wood fibre. We're constantly looking, when we mill timber, it's easy to sell the select grade timber. What's responsible and what's good business is getting the best bang for buck for all of the wood fibre, sawdust right through to quality timber. And when you start involving yourself in environmental product declarations, EPDs, for example, um, and you look to have a high performing EPD, so that's something with understanding your embodied energy within production, it becomes apparent that the best thing to do is to take byproducts that are currently going to short-term uses and transition those into something that can be used for a long term and really help ramp up the bioeconomy transition.
So you mentioned before a 15-story building in Melbourne. What was the name of that building?
So that 15-story building in Collingwood, it's T3, 36 Wellington Street. It's an initiative by global development company Hines in conjunction with Sumitomo, but built with Icon builders here in Vic. We've done a couple of jobs with Icon now, and we've got a great relationship. But yeah, that project, T3 Collingwood, it's a poster child for us. It went very well.
And it was the flooring, is that correct? The flooring and beams that were part of the Masslam product?
So we did the columns and beams for that project, and XLAM did the CLT floors.
Okay, sorry.
Our role in that project was helping inform design, so the connections, but also how they need to be machined on the robotic CNCs. We have a team of in-house design engineers who understand manufacturing, but also understand engineering. So their job is to help create a cost-efficient delivered solution. To explain that, if we let somebody else engineer the connections between a column and a beam, and this is how we started, a connection alone can cost $1,200 just for that one connection. But then you have to CNC it, and that CNCing on the robots took 4 hours in that case. Then it goes to site and it has to be built off the back of a truck with a crane. Now, if that takes a long time, the compounding effect of that, the buildability, really blows out your costs on site. Our in-house design team understand the engineering of our timber, they understand the speed of our robots, and they understand install speed on site. And so they connect those together and help inform connection design. So T3 Collingwood, we had a 3-minute average install time per member. They built 10 stories of timber building in under 60 days. It's incredible.
So I guess it's really a push towards more of a turnkey solution where the fabricator or the manufacturer is involved earlier in the process, right?
Absolutely. We worked that out early on. You mentioned before our emergence into the mass timber space. We're now easily the largest post and beam manufacturer of mass timber in Australia. The way we started was with this idea that we'll be manufacturers. We were already great manufacturers. We'll let other people do design and we'll stay manufacturing. What became obvious pretty early on is for people to gain the benefit and building mass timber, we need these to be as cost efficient as they possibly can. So over time, we've built that team internally to offer a free service up front. Yes, it comes at a cost to us, but it makes projects realise those cost efficiencies and it gets us repeat business.
Do you find that Ash often collaborates with other, I guess, mass timber partners as well? You mentioned before XLAM, who involved in cross-laminated timber, and there's almost like a bit of a synergy between the different fabricators as well on projects.
Absolutely. We do posts and beams really well. They do CLT really well, cross-laminated timber flooring. I don't do CLT, and they don't do mass timber post and beams. So naturally, when it comes to an office building, post and beam construction, we tend to work on a lot of projects together. Now, that's not just XLAM Australia. We also work with international manufacturers, and now Next Timber, we're doing a couple of projects with them now. Same model. We have, like I mentioned before, we have a great internal team who understand post and beams. They understand their CLT really well. We typically do our components, and through the magic of building these things in virtual reality, the two systems can overlay together. They use our model to overlay their CLT. We can see how it all interfaces. The robots do the rest. Works well.
Yeah, I guess the whole concept of AI construction, it's really gone a long way from where we thought it would go 15 years ago, where we thought we'd just be 3D printing buildings. It's, you know, it's very interesting, isn't it, how we can now use programs like Midjourney and so forth to almost create new projects to life and then work to install them as well.
Yeah, look, we're certainly not at the point where Midjourney is doing the work for us, but from an architectural intent or an inspiration, I mean, it definitely puts out some nice looking, attractive design concepts. Something we talk about all the time is how can we use these tools or this software or AI to streamline what we do, and that is the next step. We've mentioned before CLT Toolbox, good friends of ours in the industry. They've started a software package to help train or upskill the engineering sector, to help make it easy for them to design in mass timber. So they've done some great work. We were the first financial contributors and participants in their software. But we've got new software that we're looking to roll out shortly, which will be for the architects and designers to help them design cost-efficient mass timber structures with the client, so that by the time they come to us, they're already cost-efficient and there's less hiccups. One of the biggest roadblocks in mass timber construction is, there's 2030 climate targets, there's these ESD goals from massive companies, and 2030 is coming. So a lot of them are looking to do mass timber, but it might start with a design intent. They may or may not have experience in mass timber, and the temptation naturally is to design for the efficiencies that you're used to. So in this case, that's largely concrete and steel. Now, if you design for the cost efficiencies of concrete and steel and not for the efficiencies of timber, you're going to design something that's creating an outcome that's more cost efficient for concrete and steel. So the software we're looking to develop is to help upskill the designers and specifiers as well, so that they can design a cost efficient mass timber building that it meets their design intent before it even comes to us, and then we can hit the ground running.
Yeah, and you mentioned before CLT Toolbox. They're now in the European and the American market as well. There was a report out last month that looked at, in order to scale up mass timber construction, you need to look at ways to effectively make it mainstream. Because you mentioned before, depending on what type of project you might have a construction crew that aren't adapt to working with mass timber, and it could add all sorts of inefficiencies as well, isn't that right? So that's something that we need to look at. One of the big pushes I've noticed in the market over the last 6 to 12 months is the push into the build to rent and residential construction areas. Is that something that you've noticed as well at Ash? There's been a really big push to pivot mass timber mid-rise into the build to rent market as well.
That's the next step. There's no doubt there's a lot of focus from government and developers on the build to rent market and the social housing space in general. We've got a growing population, we need to house them, and it makes sense to build mid-rise 4 to 10 story structures near transport in areas that people want to live. And this is the mantra of the government: beautiful homes where people want to live. And land starts to become a bottleneck. It's a restriction. So we're seeing the mass timber space do reasonably well in the office construction market. But in the post-COVID world, we've got more and more people working from home and less working in office buildings. And so that commercial space, as of today, it's a pretty tough space. So a lot of projects that were going to be going ahead this year have had the handbrake pulled up. They might be delayed a year or two. And Um, at the same time, you've got huge investment and huge focus on build to rent and government housing. So Ash and our Masslam product, we're definitely focusing on that. We've got a great mass timber solution which uses post and beams and our ATC flooring cassette, so that's advanced timber composites. It's essentially a flooring panel that we can prefabricate in our factory and deliver to site. It uses roughly a quarter of the timber that CLT would, um, and it has a number of benefits that give us some differences to CLT. So CLT is a great product, but when you look to span longer than 6 metres, it starts to have some limitations. We can span to 9 metres cost efficiently. Or if you're looking to expose the timber, so you're looking up at the feet, in a residential building, typically the temptation is to hide CLT behind fire-rated plasterboard, which obviously adds cost, it adds load, it takes more time on site. But importantly, with developers and builders looking to build in mass timber, it's also about marketing that. It's also about showing that this building is better than carbon neutral. And if you end up having to add all these materials to hide them, it kind of undermines that. And it also adds cost, right? So what we developed in ATC is a system that is naturally DTS for fire. We can show off our full timber structure. We don't have to hide it, which is a huge benefit, and it's beautiful. So that means that you don't have to hide that behind plasterboard, but it also means you don't have to add joinery to hide it because it's the structure and it is the aesthetic. So it's a good win from that standpoint. But inherently, it also has acoustic and vibration performance built into it. It's a great system.
It's interesting you mentioned for the, I guess, this push towards actually exposing the mass timber elements as a marketing thing. Montrachet Apartments in downtown Brisbane originally went for a mass timber solution because of the weight over a major tunnel, but they ended up actually selling the apartments at a premium based on the applied mass timber finish as well, which is an unexpected advantage, I guess, of looking to develop the tangible and the intangibilities of mass timber.
Absolutely, it is. We talking about hurdles before. One of the hurdles that the industry still needs to find a solution for and promote, I think we have the solution, but it needs to be better understood, is these designs will happen without a mass timber manufacturer or advisor like ourselves or others. And they'll go through a design and costing phase, and then they'll either get the green light or the red light. And the costing phase of a mass timber structure is still something that's causing a lot of confusion. It's not the cost assessor's fault. It's not the engineers who are designing it. It's not the architect's fault. There's an infinite number of ways that you can design a mass timber structure. But what seems to be happening is these cost contingencies get thrown at it, and we can overcome those if we're involved. But one of those is when they're taking the cost assessment, they look at a concrete structure and they overlay the timber structure. All they do is they swap the concrete and the timber components and say, well, that's your cost. They're not subtracting the other things that they need to subtract. You mentioned before lightweight. That can have an impact on the foundations. There can be significantly less foundations if you're building it in a lighter weight timber structure. So they're the sorts of things that need to start being embedded into cost efficiencies. But the other one is lining and joinery. Now, you don't have to hide that behind plasterboard. You don't have to bring in joinery. You don't have to bring in lining board to hide that, I'll say it, ugly, cold concrete structure and make it beautiful with timber. It's naturally beautiful. So these are the things, and there's several others. These are the things that we're working through, and the industry is slowly learning over time.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're almost looking at a new way to design effectively. It's not just
Absolutely.
we often talk about the engineering elements of mass timber. It's faster, it's cleaner on site, it's lighter to install. You can build smaller buildings and turn them around faster. But the design elements and the minimalism that could be required from an interior fit outs perspective as well is also an interesting advantage as well.
Absolutely, yeah. People love timber. The data has always shown. If you've ever got your hands on some of the data, biophilia, natural light, timber plants, it's warm, it's inviting. People love timber. And building it that way from the start is a really good way of cutting cost and designing efficiently.
So with your timber cassette systems, are they typically is there a sweet spot for those type of buildings? Are they between the mid-rise, or are they also involved in some of the high-rise buildings as well?
It's a good point. We see the Goldilocks zone for our ATC and post and beam system. From the residential perspective, we see 4 to 10 stories as being the sweet spot. Once you get over 10 stories, you start getting some other complexities that we can still fit within, but you start getting fire engineers being a little bit more conservative. But there's a huge space in a huge market in the 4 to 10 story, particularly in the social housing or built to rent kind of market. We don't need to be in the 40-story building type of space. Yes, those conversations are happening and people are looking to push the envelope, particularly in hybrid timber, concrete, steel structures. And yes, we're involved in those. But we don't need to chase that for the build to rent and the social housing space. 4 to 10 stories is great. Now, something we get asked quite a bit at the moment is, what about 3 stories, 2 stories?
Yes.
Yes, we can do that. And yes, we would do that. But stick framing is really efficient. We've got such a great frame and truss market in Australia. The supply is there. The design expertise is there. They can do up to 3 stories efficiently. When you get to 4 stories and up, you start to get fire and acoustics, and you start to get these other concerns growing. Structural is only one. That's our sweet spot. It's where we can offer some serious advantage. We can get some cost efficiencies, and the client gets the benefit of those.
It's an interesting point you raised about the established frame and truss market. There's been a lot of talk around pushing to increase the prefabrication of building materials, but we already have an established frame and truss market where they could actually start introducing some of those innovations within the appropriate businesses themselves as well. So you mentioned before the Victorian government. Last year they released the Victorian government housing statement that had some pretty grand and ambitious push towards developing infill sites and removing the ghastly housing, concrete jungle housing complexes throughout inner city Melbourne. Has Ash been involved in some of the discussions around developing newer, greener and cleaner infill sites around Melbourne as well?
I don't know how much I'm allowed to discuss.
Of course, we're only a public forum.
Yeah. I'll say, look, I mean, you can't ever call a project something that you're involved in unless you've got a contract, right? But there's a number of designers, there's a number of government bodies, there's a number of engineers all working on various things, and we're talking to quite a few, and we'd love to do a lot of these projects in mass timber. And it looks to me like we'd be more than suitable at particularly exceeding the procurement policies that the government set for themselves. When I look at that and I read through those, if they're serious about building these homes in the areas they want to build them, that are environmentally friendly, that are better than carbon neutral, that are built fast so they can get people in homes quickly, I don't think they can look past mass timber. And so I see what we're putting together with them as being one of, not the only, but one of the better solutions for them.
Do you notice there's a bit of a difference between states in terms of mass timber adoption? Is Victoria, New South Wales, Sydney, Melbourne ahead of the game compared to Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth, or is it typically quite consistent across the major cities?
That's an interesting question. I've never put much thought to that. I'd say we're having different conversations with different states about different things. I'd say New South Wales are well ahead on the schools front and public institutional buildings. Um, Obviously, there's the games coming up in Queensland soon, which has a whole different conversation. Here in Vic, they announced the social housing and build to rent sort of campaign before New South Wales. As of today, I think New South Wales just announced one only maybe 2 weeks ago. So there's different conversations happening in different states. Like all things government or funded by the state, I don't think they've happened until they've happened. And the speed at which they happen is probably when I can give you an accurate answer. They haven't happened yet.
Just one final question, Daniel, and thank you very much for your time today. You mentioned before the fact that, you know, the bread and butter and the next generation of mass timber is really focusing on that 4 to 10 story sweet spot. You know, have you got any thoughts on the fact that Australia now has proposals to build the biggest timber roof in the world, has 3 of the top buildings out of hybrid timber in the world, either under construction or in design at the moment, but we've really struggled to bed down the bread and butter? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's tempting to build the biggest and build the best and the tallest in the world. And I think I'd only be assuming this, but one reason for that could be that building in a tough market, particularly the market we're in right now, cutting through the fat, revealing yourselves as being the investment to be in, or the house to be in, or the stadium for the government. It's tempting to do mass timber in those environments, but the reality is the sweet spot and the bulk of the market is that 4 to 10 story. And I think if we're serious about meeting 2030 climate targets, if we're serious about these big ESG commitments that governments and corporates have made, the way we're going to get there is in the medium density. It's in the 4 to 10 stories. Sure, I'll take the 40-story hybrid timber structure and I'll take the marketing that comes with that. But I'll also take the 20 or 30 4 to 10 story buildings that don't get the promotion, but they actually give us the economy of scale. They give us the volume that we need to run a manufacturing plant. They don't have the glory, but they make it work.
Daniel, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Good to be here.